It's raining outside. You barely notice it. You pulled up a hood, or you sat by a window with tea, or you drove through it in a warm car with the wipers on. Rain is a mild inconvenience, something you check a weather app for, something you complain about. For almost all of human history, that same rain, falling on the same landscape, was a threat that could kill you within days.
Because ancient humans didn't have raincoats. They didn't have roofs, most of them. They didn't have a way to dry out. And they lived through storms that make ours look small. Real, sustained, sky-cracking rain that could last weeks, sometimes months, sometimes across whole generations. So here's the question. When the rain didn't stop, what did they actually do? How does a small group of half-naked primates sleeping on the ground survive a wet season that soaks everything they own? The answer is genuinely remarkable, and most of it never gets talked about. Because before there were houses, before there were roofs, before there was anything you'd recognize as protection from the sky, humans had already engineered their way through the wet.
Let's start with what the rain was actually like. We tend to imagine the ancient world as basically the same climate we have now, just without buildings. That is not what our ancestors dealt with. Earth's climate has swung wildly over the last few 100,000 years. There were long stretches called the African humid periods, when the Sahara wasn't a desert at all. It was green, full of lakes, and the rains during those periods were far heavier and more prolonged than anything modern humans experience today. In parts of Africa, the monsoon didn't just bring afternoon storms. It brought weeks of sustained downpour, filling ancient lake basins to margins we can still map with satellites.
And then there were the Ice Age reversals. The Younger Dryas.
Around 12,900 to 11,700 years ago,
was one of the most brutal climate events humans have ever lived through.
In northern Europe, it turned entire regions extremely cold and extremely wet at the same time, a combination that is arguably harder to survive than either alone. A study published in Scientific Reports on radiocarbon dates from Belgium and the southern North Sea basin found that during the first half of the Younger Dryas, the archaeological record almost empties out. Human populations in that region collapsed. People either died or they left. Rain plus cold, at scale, was one of the fastest ways prehistoric humans could disappear from a landscape. So when we ask how ancient humans survived endless rain, we're not asking a small question. We're asking how a species with almost no technology outlived storms that erased whole populations. The answer starts with real estate. The first solution was the one you'd expect. You find something with a roof. In prehistoric times, that meant a cave or a rock shelter. This wasn't a preference. This was survival. Almost every major hominin site we've ever excavated is either a cave, a rock shelter, or a defensible overhang. And the reason isn't just predator defense. It's water. A dry cave is worth more than any tool you could ever make. It keeps your fire alive. It keeps your bedding dry. It keeps your children warm. Sites like Pinnacle Point in South Africa, Sibudu Cave in KwaZulu-Natal, Border Cave along the same coast, these places were occupied on and off for tens of thousands of years. And their value wasn't the walls, it was the ceiling. But there weren't enough caves. There have never been enough caves. Most groups didn't have one. And this is where humans got creative, in ways we still don't fully appreciate. There's a category of prehistoric shelter that almost never survives archaeologically, because it was made of the things rain destroys: wood, hide, grass, bark, bone. But we can reconstruct it. Across the ancient world, humans built temporary shelters out of whatever plant material was around, propped up with mammoth bones or wooden poles, weighted down with stones. Some of these were surprisingly sophisticated. A single family could throw together a rain-shedding hut in an afternoon, take it apart in the morning, carry the frame poles with them, and set it up again wherever they stopped that night. Portable architecture. 10,000 years before what we usually call architecture existed.
One man, one voice, from the first word to the last, never changing. A man speaking in his own natural voice, relaxed and clear, unmistakably male. Fire went inside, food went inside, people went inside. And the rain hit a slanted roof of skin or thatch and ran off.
And when even that failed, when the storm was too big, when the group was caught in the open, humans did the thing every huddled animal has ever done. They gathered around the fire and protected it with their bodies. Because if the fire went out in a serious storm, you weren't just cold. You were slowly killing yourselves. Wet clothes don't dry without heat. Wet bedding gets you sick. Wet wood won't light. So one of the oldest jobs in any tribe was firekeeping. And in the rain, that job became life or death. There's a reason ancient hearths, when archaeologists excavate them, often show layer after layer of ash built up in the same spot over decades or centuries. That fire was never allowed to die. Someone was always shielding it. One man, one voice, from the first word to the last, never changing. A man speaking in his own natural voice, relaxed and clear, unmistakably male. Someone was always feeding it dry kindling, stashed for exactly this reason. Fire, in the rain, was tended the way a modern hospital tends a life support machine. Now here's where the story gets genuinely surprising, because for a long time, we thought prehistoric humans essentially just endured the rain, grim, wet, cold, waiting for it to pass. Recent archaeology says something different. It says they engineered their way out of it. And the evidence is in something so small, you'd walk past it in a museum without noticing. A needle. At Sibudu Cave in South Africa, in layers dating to about 61,000 years ago, archaeologists found what is likely the oldest known bone needle in the world. Not just any tool, a needle with wear marks consistent with being pushed through animal hide, over and over thousands of times. Someone at Sibudu was sewing. And they weren't sewing crude flaps. The associated toolkit at that site includes bone wedges and a compound adhesive made of plant gum and ochre from at least 71,000 years ago. That is prehistoric humans making glue. That is prehistoric humans making tailored, layered garments that fit the body. That is prehistoric humans making clothing that could shed water. And it gets more astonishing. At Denisova Cave in Siberia, researchers found an eyed needle, a bone needle with a threading hole punched through it, dating to around 50,000 years ago. Same technology, on the other side of the world. In fact, a comprehensive review published in Science Advances in 2024 traced the spread of eyed needles across the prehistoric world, and the pattern is unmistakable. Around 40,000 years ago in Siberia, 38,000 years ago in the Caucasus, 30,000 years ago in East Asia, 26,000 years ago in Europe. Wherever humans pushed into cold, wet climates, the needles appeared, because the needles were how they survived.
And then there's the piece that connects all of this. A set of tools that most people have never heard of. In 2013, a study published in the journal PNAS identified standardized deer rib bone tools at several sites in southwest France called lissoirs, bone smoothers. What did they do? They were used to burnish hide, to rub it over and over until the leather became softer, and this is the key part, more water resistant. These are among the first specialized bone tools known in Europe, dating back around 50,000 years, and some of them were used by Neanderthals, not just modern humans. Different hominins on the same continent, both figuring out the same trick.
When you rub the hide long enough with the right bone, the fibers compress, the pores close, and water starts to bead on the surface instead of soaking through. Think about what that means. 50,000 years ago, people were manufacturing water-resistant leather. Not perfectly waterproof, but functional. Enough to keep the rain off for the hours you needed to move, hunt, or find shelter. That's a raincoat. That's a hood. That's the tarpaulin over the fire. And the technology to make it was carried across generations, taught parent to child, refined for tens of thousands of years, long before farming, long before cities, long before writing. And in 2026, a study came out that pushed one more piece of the puzzle even further. Researchers re-examining hide fragments and cordage from Conley Caves in Oregon confirmed that these pieces of sewn animal hide, stitched together with plant and animal cords, are around 12,000 years old, quite possibly a fragment of clothing or footwear. That may be the oldest known sewn clothing anywhere in the world. 12,000 years ago, in a cave in what is now the American West, people were making shoes. So put it all together. The picture that emerges is not humans huddling helplessly under trees. The picture is a species with a stacked toolkit for rain. Caves at the top of the stack. Portable shelters when caves ran out. Fire, kept alive under any conditions. Tailored, layered, water-resistant hide clothing, sewn with needles and glued with plant resins. Shoes, at least at the end of the Ice Age. And a knowledge base, passed from generation to generation, of which plants shed water, which caves stayed dry, which slopes drained, which valleys flooded, and when it was time to leave. Because the fifth and final answer to how ancient humans survived endless rain is the one you might not expect. Sometimes they didn't stay. Sometimes they walked away. Human beings are the only animal that will move an entire community, thousands of miles, in response to weather. And in the deep past, they did this constantly. When the Younger Dryas made northwestern Europe uninhabitable, populations shrank and shifted southward. When the African humid periods flooded ancient lake basins, hunter-fisher-gatherers followed the shorelines and set up new lives around the new water. When a rock shelter in Indonesia, called Here Sorot and Tapa, became too hot and food scarce during a climate shift, the people there simply left, and the site was abandoned for more than 3,000 years. Humans read the sky. They read the wet. And when the weather told them a place was becoming a death trap, they trusted it and moved.
That mobility is one of the deepest reasons our species survived climate events that ended other hominin lineages entirely.
So the next time it rains, and you sigh and pull up your hood and complain about the weather, pause for a second. Because that hood is not new. That hood is 50,000 years old. Someone in a cave in France, or Siberia, or South Africa, spent hours rubbing a piece of hide with the rib of a deer until it kept the water off, and taught their child how to do it. And their child taught theirs. And somewhere down that chain of thousands of generations, the technique reached your grandmother's coat, and eventually, the jacket you're wearing right now.
Your ancestors did not sit passively in the rain. They watched it. They studied it. They engineered around it. And when it was truly endless, they gathered under the driest ceiling they could find, kept the fire alive with their own hands, wrapped themselves in leather made specifically for this, and waited it out. Together. In the dark, listening to the storm, the way people have listened to storms 100,000 years, knowing that it would pass, knowing that they had done everything they could to make sure they were still there when it did. That's not survival. That's mastery of the sky itself.